Okay, great. Welcome everybody to the book club with Jill Davies and Eleanor Lyon. I'm Eileen from the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and I'm so happy to have both Jill and Eleanor on the phone with us. They've been very gracious to help me with this, and I'm just really looking forward to a great conversation with you all. So welcome. Hopefully technology is working well for all of you, or at least working. And I'm going to go through some logistics before we get started with the content. But if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand or chat in the question box, and I'll show you how to do that if you don't know how to do that already. So a little about logistics first. So listening. I have young kids, so I always like to say it's always a good idea. And what we recommend is to listen through your computer speakers, which would mean to have your mic and speakers checked rather than what's circled. But if that's not working, you can select the telephone option, and then it has further instructions for you on what the audio pin is. So hopefully you all can hear me, and this is helping to have the instructions, but it's also on your screen if you can't. So let us know if you're having trouble, but hopefully it should work either way. You're all muted, so and then we can unmute you, but you're all muted, so don't worry about your background noise right now, unless you're going to ask a question. We really want you to participate. Again, I phrased this before, is we really want this to be a conversation. Eleanor and Jill have, said that they are happy to answer questions, and actually that's what we're looking for. So a book club is not much if it's not a discussion. So that's what we're really looking for. So you can use the question box to write your questions, or feel free if you are using the telephone, or if you have a built-in microphone on your computer, you're welcome to raise your hand. Meta Earlywine is here helping me, and she's going to help me kind of see the questions and if hands are raised. So we should be able to manage that. A little tip for you, this has happened to me a number of times, and it's helpful now that we tell people what to do about it. If your panel minimizes, often it minimizes to the side, it's always on the right side for me, you can just click that orange arrow to get it back. So if it disappears and you want to write a question, just click that arrow. And then finally, for attendance and evaluations, there's going to be, at the end of this, a form will pop up, and the first thing it asks you is who else attended this webinar. So if you're in a group watching this right now, it'd be really helpful if you answer that with everyone who is on the call, and then of course tell us how it was for you. We really take those seriously, and it really helps us to have content and processes that are better for you. So hopefully we've covered all the logistics that you need, and now we can just dive in. So our agenda for the call today is to talk about the book briefly and introduce our great authors, and then really dive into what Jill and Eleanor call victim-defined advocacy. And you'll find that we use that terminology throughout the PowerPoint that you're going to see today. And we usually refer to that as survivor-centered advocacy here in our state, but we'll use those terms interchangeably, but that's what we mean. And then we'll give you some practical tips, but really we hope questions and comments are sprinkled throughout. You don't need to wait until the end. I just put it in there because that's for sure when we'll have a slide, that says it, but we hope that you'll ask questions throughout. So feel free to chat something or put a question in the question box anytime, or raise your hand if you want to ask some clarifying questions. How I've structured this is that we have some slides with content, but we may jump around depending on what we talk about and what's asked. And I will send all of you the PowerPoint at the end of the webinar, so you'll be able to get all of this information as well. So let's start with why this book. So I was an advocate when the first edition of this book came out, Safety Planning with Battered Women, and I worked in a program, and I remember my supervisor handing me this book, and she said something like, I read this and I just can't even believe how many things we're doing wrong. That's always a little bit worrisome when you get that, but she said, take a look and see what you think. And I read it, and this was what I had thought was that this is what I want, that I wish I could live up to what the book was putting forth, and that was really a goal for my advocacy. And actually, it was really doable in the end. And it just seemed so, it's one of those things that, when something's written down and you hear it and you think, yes, that's right. How have we not always been saying that? And I feel like that the first book and this book as well just has great information that just feels so right, and it feels attainable, and it didn't make me feel like I was doing everything wrong. It just showed me how to do things that were maybe more in line with what I was trying to accomplish. And so we really feel that way about this second edition. It makes advocacy something really clear, and it makes it understandable for what the steps are to really have more meaningful work with survivors that works for them. And so I think it really creates a partnership that we can all attain. So that's what really spoke to me about this book, and we'll talk about the specifics. But the thing I also really like about it is that it's clear. It really does show a roadmap, and I know that all of you are actually already on the path to it, and many of you are doing different elements, and it's just sometimes nice to have it named and called out. So here is a very wordy slide telling you about all the great stuff about Jill and Eleanor, and they really just have such a wealth of expertise and information to share, and have really spent a lot of time with advocates across the country. And so they just are really informed by our work, and are able to really transform what they've seen into the best practice. So here's some info about them, but I wanted to give them an opportunity to talk about why they wrote a second edition of their book. So Jill and Eleanor, can you share with us?
Sure. This is Jill. So first of all, thank you all for joining us, and for spending some time and talking about the book. We really appreciate that. And thank you, Eileen, for all those comments about the book. I mean, we are advocates, and we wrote the book for advocates, so it just feels so great to hear that it's actually useful for you all and helping to support the great work you're already doing. And, when you ask, why did you write the book? Well, I think, Eleanor, a couple months in, didn't we were asking ourselves the same question, why did we take it on?
Yes.
It's really good to have a good chunk of time before a first edition and a second edition, because then you kind of forget what it's like to write a book. But, just for me, there's just, this field is so great. The people doing in this work are so amazing, and there's just was so much change from the first edition. We've just all learned so much together. There was really significantly increased literature research, which Eleanor can talk about, and we knew more, and we wanted to make it better. We just had more depth to add to it. I think we had a better understanding of victim perspectives, some of the limitations of our systemic responses that were not as clear to us when they were just beginning. We wanted to write more about kids and their safety, about the advocate role with partners who are using violence. Trauma was much more important to us now, obviously, and we wanted to include that. And an area that we referenced in the first edition but really didn't explore in depth was this whole concept of working and doing advocacy with victims who are in contact or remaining in their relationship. So we were just really appreciative to have a second chance at sort of making it better and sharing the things that we've learned and that we've learned from advocates and from victims. Al, do you have anything to add?
Oh, probably. Although, you actually did quite a good job of sort of honestly reflecting where we were and where we came to decide that we wanted to do this. And I just want to add my thanks and appreciation for all of you for being here and for your work. I am now in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, so I'm right next door, and we use you as models very often. So thanks for that. I think it was really the change in what we had learned both from advocates, and I'm the sort of research nerd in the group, and so from the research as well. Jill calls me the parentheses queen, so those of you who are really sort of chafing at all those parentheses in the text, you can blame me for those. The
we
good
thank you for that,
ideas
Eleanor.
are attributable to Jill. But we had really learned a whole lot more, not only about kids and about mental health and about trauma and substance abuse and work with partners, but also about cultural differences, and much more attention had been paid to people who had experienced immigration and were in varying degrees of becoming more experienced with this culture. We had learned more about the importance of thinking not just individually but more collectively, more about the family and the importance of community. I think we also had changed to some degree in how we think about this and how we understand what's possible. And just, again, a better understanding of the context for each person, both advocate and victim survivor.
You know, if I might jump in just and add a little bit about why we chose the word victim. And I'm telling you, Eleanor and I agreed on almost everything, but we really had to talk about this a long time because, you know, it just, we talked about it a lot, we thought about it, we went back and forth, and we really agonized because we really don't think any of the words that we use right now to describe folks who are experiencing violence really reflect the amazing depth that they have, their resilience, but also their experience and pain of the violence. So we went back and forth. We talked a lot about it. We ended up choosing victim for a number of reasons. One is that it acknowledges and honors the harm that's experienced. And, you know, we're going to talk more about a broader definition of safety, I'm sure, in part of this webinar. And so we wanted to make sure we didn't lose that really important piece of the experience. There were times when being age and gender neutral were useful because we want to talk about kids and adults, and because of same-sex partners. Of course, we did not want to lose the gender aspect, and so we do use in the book pronouns, and also we refer to battered women in a number of places as well, so we don't lose that. You know, and obviously when you're working with individual victims, you use whatever language that they kind of guide you to use. And I just want to acknowledge that, and I hear that you use survivor-centered. You know, I think that's fine with us. We just think that victim service in this particular book, but who knows what we'll use if we ever write a third edition, Eleanor.
Oh, excuse me. Did I make an extreme noise? I just want to sort of add from my perspective that even in our sort of perhaps a bit tortured explanation of how we had come to our terminology, we really reinforced the importance of resilience and agency in that sort of explanatory paragraph. And certainly the approach that we're talking about is all about honoring resilience and agency. So there should be no question that by using the term victim that we're using that in any other sense to suggest passivity or the recipient being a recipient of that label. We really think of people who have experienced abuse as being strong and agentic, I would use, shriek, but resilient.
Great. Well, I just really appreciate that you wrote the second edition. I want to thank you for doing that. And I think it's a great idea to keep on thinking about a third down the road. So
No.
maybe you'll just write the success story of how we ended domestic violence and have moved on to doing all sorts of other fun things.
Maybe one of you will
Yeah.
write.
Well, you know, I think in some ways this conversation has really illuminated why perhaps we recommended reading only the first chapter of the book, because there's so many concepts just even in thinking about what we call it and what victim-defined advocacy looks like. and what it can be. So I just want to remind you folks that if hopefully you've read the first chapter, but there is so much more that the book goes into, and we'll touch on some of those things throughout today, and certainly when Jill comes back with us and Eleanor joins us for one of them in the in-person trainings in May, we'll be able to dive deeper into those concepts. But if you have questions that come up because maybe you've peeked at the other chapters of the book or you've read them or you're just wondering if it's addressed, please feel free not to be limited to just that first chapter. But with that, let's kind of dive into this idea of victim-defined advocacy. And Jill and Eleanor, I'll just advance the slides if I feel like we're getting there, but feel free to also let me know if you want me to move to a particular slide. But can you just summarize what you see as the cornerstones of victim-defined advocacy and what you want folks to get from it?
Sure. I always find this the most overwhelming question because it's like it took us a whole book to explain this. But I'll take it. I'll take a run at it. So I think first of all, there's really two aspects. There's two contexts in which you do victim-defined advocacy. One is sort of working with individual victims, and the other is a systemic or policy context. So they are have the same values and approach, but they are obviously are different. So in the individual context, if you think about it sort of simply, it's combining victim priorities and advocate resources in order to enhance safety. The victim's plans and decisions really drive the focus of the advocacy. It is a kind of straightforward, but when you pull it apart, as I think you mentioned earlier, Eileen, there's a lot of components or pieces to it. So, even thinking about victim priorities and thinking about her perspective, we need to have some understanding of the risks that she's facing, both from a partner, but also what we refer to as life-generated risks, things that we all face, being laid off, health issues that are not related to the violence, bias and discrimination, those kinds of things. Her life circumstances are really important. We highlighted a couple. For example, is she a parent? That is really important. What are her cultural resources and values? And what are her resources? And then just something really simple like understanding her current plan. If she's dealing with intimate partner violence, is she going to stay or is she going to leave? Those kind of basic things. So even that first piece of understanding where she is, meeting her where she is, has a lot of complexity to it. And then the second part of this is really having the advocate share the resources, and that also has a lot of different components. You want to spend some time building some kind of partnership, and we use the phrase partnership in the book to really mean just a very simple thing of sharing tasks and information. So even if you're on a hotline call or it's a very short period of time, you're doing some kind of connection to her. Obviously, if you work with her over time, that partnership might be very strong and have a lot of depth. And you're looking at risks, you want to review them respectfully with her. You're always thinking about and identifying relevant options that are relevant to her plans, and we can talk some more about that. You want to analyze them with her. This is where advocates are a really active player. It's not just doing what victims want. We bring information and resources and experience that's so important to helping her make the best decision she possibly can given the resources and options she has. So, it's a lot of components. I don't know, Eileen, if you want to just kind of jump to slide 19, I think, if I can have that right. It shows like all these different circles.
This one?
Yeah, great, thanks. So it's kind of, if you look on the left of the screen, that's kind of the first component, her risk analysis, life circumstances, and plans. The second is really working with her to strengthen a comprehensive safety plan, the things I just talked about. And you can see these arrows going back and forth, and this is a really dynamic process. So as you're identifying options and talking about them, you're going to learn more about how she views her risks. And, maybe you'll say to her, have you thought about calling the police? And then she'll say, well, I did last time and I ended up getting arrested. So then that's, part of what you would then integrate and talk about with her and think about it. So even though when you pull them all apart with victims and you're learning what they're worried about and what's going on and what the options are, you're having these kind of conversations. So I think that's kind of the thought about sort of doing advocacy with individuals. And then, of course, it really is making the best plan possible, and for so many victims, the best plan possible still isn't what we would want it to be. So systemic advocacy, we haven't ended violence yet. We haven't ended violence against women. We haven't really reached a place where all systems are responding in ways that are really safety enhancing. So systemic advocacy is really necessary, and it's really part of doing victim-defined advocacy. And my view is that every advocate does systemic advocacy, not just folks who have the title of policy advocate.
Right.
So that's kind of an overview.
That's great. Well, we got a specific question that I think is interesting in light of that. So this question from somebody says, how do you implement victim-defined advocacy when you know what they want is not healthy for them? And then she asks further, how do you really advocate for someone who is living in a toxic situation and are unable to be open for services?
Great question. That's the challenge, right? So, maybe it would be helpful to talk a little bit about safety and safer. And if I don't answer that question, hold me to it. I'll come back to it. I think one of the things we thought a lot about as we wrote this book was about what we mean by safety, and how so much of our focus and our family violence responses are really built around no physical violence, none right now, or from the point of intervention. And we spend a lot of time thinking about how that impacts and affects victims and their safety, but also our work with them. I really thought a lot about how that view of. And I know we all want complete safety now for all victims, and that will remain our mission and our overarching goal. We're not going to lose sight of that. But I think because we all really work and advocate in the real world, we really know that some partners are not going to stop their violence, and we can't stop them all. We know that many victims are living in poverty and that they're going to face gaps in their basic human needs. And we also know there are victims whose lives are so difficult and the violence so extensive that they are going to struggle to ever really experience peace of mind and a sense of well-being. So safety, that it's truer to victims' perspectives and how they think about planning in their lives, that it's not just a reduction or elimination of violence and control, but they have to have basic human needs met. They need to have some sense of well-being. If you are not being hit, but you can't feed yourselves or your kids, or you have nowhere to live, it's really hard. It was really hard for us to kind of come to the conclusion that that person was safe. So the first thing we did was really have a broader definition of safety. And then we really thought a lot about, and you'll see in this slide, side by side, safety and safer, that an incremental, more kind of feasible better to make victims safer. And that really also for us, it wasn't that we were always looking at all that we haven't done, and that we understand that we are making a difference when we are building any of these things, when we are helping victims have more resilience to the effects of violence or emotional healing, when we're increasing their economic stability, when we're reducing violence, or making it less frequent. So, the thing of when she's making decisions that are going to result in something that we know is not good for her, well, what is the alternative? That's the thing that we're always trying to explore. And how do you do that? First you need to understand why she's there, and why you think that she's making a decision that's not right for her. Because there may be really very few choices. I mean, some victims are really in situations where they really are choosing between living with a person who hits them and living in a car and being homeless. I mean, these are not, it's not like there's one path for everybody to get out and all of those things are going to get taken care of. It really is a sort of, it's really even hard to call it a choice. It's just lots of bad options. So, one of the first things is understanding why she's in that place she's in, and really understanding how she views her risks and why what you think is right for her may or may not fit for her. It may. If you develop a partnership with her and you have that kind of trust and rapport, what you think is right, after you really explore it with her, she might share that view, but she might not. And ultimately, she faces the risks. she faces the consequences of the decision, and so that's where our advocacy has to focus. It's hard, though. I just want to acknowledge that it is hard to see somebody who's still being hit, to see someone who's not having their needs met, to see someone who's just so suffering from the effects of trauma or other issues that are kind of long-term harm that is experienced. It's really difficult as an advocate to see that and not fix it all, but we can make it better.
Yeah, so Cindy just mentioned that safe versus safer reminds her of harm reduction approach used with drug users. And so she's just saying, so she's wondering if, so you see this as a useful orientation and then understanding the incremental steps are more reality-based. And that makes sense to me for sure.
Well, also I think you kind of have to take it together with sort of taking us away from this really exclusive focus on physical violence. But that's not enough to think about for us as advocates.
Right.
Because if all you think about is physical violence, then physical separation as a safety strategy makes more sense. Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's important, again, to keep in mind that we're really focusing on the violence from or with her partner occurring in a context, and that, this may sound repetitious, but that not all the risks are coming from their partner, that they're much more complicated, they go beyond the immediate family, and so this sense of safety and safer and the broader definition of safety are really important to keep in mind.
I also think, I'm wondering too if part of the perspective of this question is not as an advocate, but also as just people living in the world where people are being abused or in unhealthy relationships. And sometimes I think the advocacy relationship does insulate us a little bit from this, whereas in our personal lives it's really hard because people aren't necessarily coming to us for resources and information. We're just in their lives. They're our friends, they're our partners, they're our sisters, whatever they are. And so I think sometimes the advocacy relationship does enable you to have different conversations because people are actively seeking you out.
Absolutely.
I
guess yeah. I just wanted to say, we're not making this broader definition of safety to try to say that that advocates have to do more. It's just, you don't necessarily have to fix it all, but you have to hear it all because that's the context in which she's making decisions. So if she's staying in a violent relationship because that's the only way she's going to be able to feed her kids, then we have to understand that. We don't necessarily have to fix everything, but we do need to understand how she's making decisions. And then when we shift to this concept of safer, it really does give us more ways to help, not necessarily more things to do. So I know you're all overwhelmed now. I am still on a legal aid program in Hartford, and so I really get that. So we're not looking for lots more work to do, but we just want to understand victims' decision making a little bit better and finding ways in which we can help.
Well, I want to focus on that piece about also that the rejecting perfection piece, because I know for me it actually felt very liberating reading that piece on safety and safer. Again, it's one of those things that once I saw it written down, I was like, yes, how have we not always been saying this? It just seems so right, because for me as an advocate, I think it's really hard when if the goal is safety and we see that that's really difficult for people and that it might not be in their future immediately, right, and that it's something really to work towards, that I think it's actually, it makes me feel more hopeful about our work if we can move to that model. So I guess for me, I was seeing it as sort of this gift that you gave us as a way to approach just the perspective of what it means to do meaningful advocacy. So I really appreciate that, and I hope that it's helpful and liberating to other people too, because I certainly found it to be that way.
Well, that was the intention. Well, that was certainly the intention. I think also it's like, our job is, we kind of get held responsible sometimes by systems and other folks around having her be safe. And I think that that has begun to equal leaving, that leaving equals safety, and that, you know, I think that, first of all, that's not true. We often say leaving is the most dangerous time. So, and it's because that's also can be true. So, you know, I think we kind of got into this, this shorthand that leaving is the answer to domestic violence, that leaving and physical separation as a safety strategy is the only way to go. And I think it's just way too narrow for the circumstances that victims are in, and it's too narrow for us as the really creative, broad, comprehensive advocates that we are to be so limited to sort of be seen as our job is to help her leave, especially if it's not going to enhance her safety. And we have to be honest here, and I think this is one of the things we wrote more about this time, it's in Chapter 5, is that for some victims, they're actually in more danger and their life is worse when they leave. That's a horrible thing to have to kind of come to grips with as an advocate, because we don't want that for anyone. But it's really true. So then we need to think about what is our work then. So, you know, we can't do that all. We can't do it all.
Yeah, and you had also mentioned, and this we don't necessarily have a slide for this, but one of the chapters was Chapter 3 that I thought was so interesting, and Eleanor, I think this may be more of what you focused on, was just the research about decision making. And I don't know if you want to just share a little bit. I found that to be really compelling and interesting. I mean, again, it all resonated with what I knew and had experienced, but it was so great seeing it, you know, actually, you know, that it has been studied. And so I don't know if you have anything to sort of share about that. I think that's a great chapter to read. It's also one of those things that might be really helpful for boards and community members to read, because they often don't get that perspective.
And thanks. I'm really glad that was your experience of it, because that's sort of what we were hoping to accomplish. And I guess one of the things that Jill and I talked about after the first book was how many times in the first book we had said it's complicated, and we tried to really reduce that because we wanted to present something that was much more doable and understandable, and it didn't get so complicated that it became confusing. But I think one of the things that in looking at women's decision, well, it's mostly women's decision making that's been studied, is that it is complicated, and there's not like one linear kind of progression. There's not one moment that decisions change. They change with circumstances. They evolve with the experience of the kinds of things that they have tried. So, you know, I mean, we're really active, resilient, looking for solutions. We try things, they don't work. We try something else, or we try things, they work, and then we try to do more of that thing that worked. And so it's not like all the research is consistent. And unfortunately, you know, it has to be sort of complicated to try to take into account all the various life circumstances that victim survivors are experiencing, but sort of start off with maybe a stay leave kind of decision, and it's, if I leave, is it going to be better? And then if you think it might be better, is there a way to do it? But to do that, you're taking into account not just the violence, but the kids and your relationship with them, and you're taking into account your abusive partner and your relationship with that person. And then you're thinking about all the resources that you may have to call on, friends, family, community, institutional resources, financial resources. All of that goes into the mix that leads to specific decisions that happen in response to specific circumstances. And so it's really in flux, and one thing is more important at one moment and another thing is more important at another moment, which is why we keep talking about advocacy needing to have flexibility and understanding sort of where an individual person is at a particular point in time. That may be overly complicated as a response, but
well, I think it's just, I mean, I know for me it's just really aligned with my own experiences of making decisions, right? It's really complex. It depends where I'm at. And it's gratifying to see that reflected in the research. And I think it's a helpful tool for when you constantly are having to justify the actions of people. You know, we like to joke that we have to remind people sometimes that women are people. But sometimes we have to remind folks that, you know, survivors and victims are people, right? They're behaving as people, which is, people are complex and they have a lot of different things that make that help them make choices and are barriers. And so I think it's just helpful to see that how that plays out.
And the more we can learn about what those individual sets of circumstances are and their history, the more we can understand that people are usually making very reasonable kinds of choices and decisions, even if we don't recognize that sort of at first blush. So hopefully that sense of resilience and folks being people, folks being, you know, doing things that actually can be understood as sensible, even if not desirable.
Right. I think that's a really good distinction, the sensible versus desirable. That makes a lot of sense. If your menu of options is really limited, there might not be any desirable choices on there. I like that distinction. Those words make sense to me.
I guess the other thing I would add is just, you know, victims are humans, and they also have the right to make decisions about their relationships and their family. Mm-hmm. You know, these are really big decisions. I mean, not every relationship is a long-term one or involving children, but a lot of them are, especially the ones that the folks that we're working with. And you know, you don't lose the right to make decisions about your family because someone in your family is violent.
Yeah. Ooh, let's make a bumper sticker that says that. I like
yeah. I know, that's a kind of a low bumper sticker. Yeah, it is complicated, right, Eleanor? We always laugh at each other because it's complicated. But you know, I think that sometimes we forget that, like, the judge doesn't get to make that decision, the advocate doesn't get to make that decision. I mean, we all are probably in some circumstance in our lives where someone from the outside could say, what? You know, some people would say, why are we doing the jobs we're doing? They're stressful, they're causing secondary traumatic stress, it's affecting your family, why are you staying in that job? And you know, that's a complicated decision for us. And there's a commitment to it that is sometimes as strong as folks have to their families. So, you know, we don't want people telling us what to do, and so we don't want to be telling victims what to do either.
Right. I'm sitting here with Meta. Meta does not enjoy being told what to do. we're looking at each other and smiling about that. That's great. I'm trying to figure out, we skipped over a few of the cornerstones of the victim-defined approach, so I'm just going to go back to that if there's anything that you want to make sure that you cover that we haven't done. So I'm just going to go back to that. Let's see. I liked this one. And because to me, you know, again, I think that the book really lays out an approach and a doable, practical process. So I don't know if you've, you know, after talking with advocates across the country, if you've learned anything that is helpful to share with actually how to put it in place or anything that you want to add about that.
Well, you know, there's a phrase we've been using actually since I started teaching this back in the 90s, right, Eleanor? You were there evaluating the trainings, but, you know, it was like her first, then you. And it's not like you are still important, you the advocate, but her first, and like getting enough and listening. And, you know, one of the things I also like to say is if you have like a 10-page safety planning form or intake form, have some fun and go and tear them up and just, you know, try to start with an open-ended question like, what are you worried about? How do you think I can help you? Those kinds of questions really, you know, I work in a legal aid agency and we often ask a question, how do you think a lawyer can help you? Because you learn a lot about what people think you can do and can't do and whatever. And and what their priorities are. And so there's a lot of steps in this and all these different components, but you can learn a lot by just getting what her priorities are, because you want to know what her priorities are, not just not just the laundry list, like what's the last time he hit you and the first time he hit you, and did he have, you want to get a sense of her risks, but you also want to know what's really on her mind right now. So, I love that you kind of have learned. I think that's really important to sort of start with listening and the partnership, some connection. It's this work, the experience of violence is such a profound betrayal of trust. And for so many victims, they are experiencing the effects of trauma, that establishing some connection, some rapport, and it's really challenging because it's across the circumstances in which you're working, which might be hotline, or it might be the 15 minutes you have in court, or it might be a limited amount of time. There are cultural barriers and language barriers and all kinds of things. But having some connection is going to just be so important when you then come in and say, hey, tell me about your kids. And that partnership can be built in so many ways, and I know that you all know how to do that, but it's just take a little time to do that, and worry less about completing your forms and your stats. Sorry, I just said that.
We love it.
You said that. I agree, by the way.
I know you do. Make a kind of a human connection, and this idea of implementing the plan. You can have a great plan on paper, and as Eleanor just said, plans are going to change, which is always so frustrating. I know as an advocate, they always seem to change, like on a Friday afternoon, just when you're trying to get out for a long weekend. And then she calls you and it's like, hey, I decided I'm going back. And then you have to kind of do a whole different range of safety planning. But, thinking about implementing the plan, can she really do it? Is it really doable? Is such an important test of whether or not it's going to make her safer. So, I think what you put in the little bubble there, that the victim's perspective drives the direction of the options and information, is really important. It doesn't mean that we're not going to talk about things she's not raising. Like if we think she's in life-threatening danger and she's not giving us any indication that she thinks that, we're going to have that conversation, but it may not be the first thing we say to her. First, we want to see what's on her mind.
Right.
Yeah, if I can just sort of say the same thing in a couple of different words. I'm doing work on trauma-informed programs and that kind of stuff, and one of the things that we're doing as part of that is a lot of focus groups with both advocates and victim survivors. And some of the stuff that we have been it has been reinforced that we've been learning through all of this is what your experience no doubt is. The importance of the connection, the importance of listening. So many people have just said, somebody finally listened to me and didn't judge me, and that made me feel so much safer that then they were able to sort of move on. So just that as such a critical part. I know you know this again, but I just wanted to reinforce that, how crucial that is, because I think we can lose sight of it even though we do understand that.
Yeah, I think both of you really touched on that. The advocates know what works, and I would imagine that most advocates don't think that lots of paperwork and long intake forms and all of that is the way to make connections, and I think they're also bound by some things that are expected of them, and so that's something that the Coalition, we really want to support you to be able to do meaningful advocacy. And so if that's something that you are struggling with, let us know, and we're happy to, figure out, maybe sitting down and seeing what can work, because oftentimes the expectation is that's what is expected, but it's actually not. What's expected is doing meaningful advocacy, and that can look really different, but sometimes we get stuck in the paperwork bind of that. So that's something I'm really interested in helping people think about, because I know it's sometimes like the tyranny of the paperwork. I feel like as an advocate is really, I know for me that was really hard. So maybe it's all projection, right? It's something about me, but we want to support you.
Yeah. Right. I would say as a lawyer, I don't want to say like, the heck with paperwork. That just seems wrong somehow. But it's just kind of how you do it. and when you do it. And I think, you know, obviously domestic violence, particularly when it's battering, and we can talk some more about those categories, but when it's that kind of battering, domination, control form of violence, you know, removing her autonomy, her thoughts, her control of even the most simple things is sometimes so pervasive for them that taking a moment to explain what you're doing and asking permission can be so empowering. And I think, Eleanor, I love that there's research to back up common sense. I always love that. But listening is really undervalued. And, you know, I just really advocate for explaining, like, hey, you know, I got to take down I have some questions now that I just have to do in order for us to keep getting money. Do you mind if I just ask you a few other questions? And, you know, sometimes people start with it to get it out of the way, but it's better to do it later, I guess. So it's not just that it's not just what you're doing, but how and when you're doing it. And so, you know, the freedom to kind of do it when it feels right, I think is great. And I agree with you. Advocates know how to do that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm going to jump to that, to the slide that actually has the information about the different categories, because that might be a helpful frame also for people. So if you want to address that.
Well, here's another thing we just made up, right, Eleanor?
Sort of, yeah.
So again, I mean, I'll start out and Eleanor jump in, but, you know, we thought a lot about these categories, and a lot of categories are defined by the legal system. And I think the legal system is really limited in its ability to create categories that are useful outside of the legal system. So we didn't find all these kind of narrow definitions in the situational violence and other research that was done that trying to categorize violence. And it just seemed like if we create these really narrow categories, then victims are either going to fall in the category or outside the category, or they're going to have to prove that they're in the category in order to get the help that they need. So we wanted to not do that. We wanted to not create these kind of categories that were going to cause more problems. On the other hand, when you're doing advocacy, it's important to know what you're dealing with. And a lot of the violence that we see in the work that we do because of family violence responses being so broad is not battering. It's not that classic domestic violence of power and control. And so there's different gender aspects to it. There's different experiences of it. There's different levels of danger. And there's just a need to have different responses. So we thought these broad categories of battering and non-battering would be really helpful, and to not try to force everything that we're dealing with into a category of battering or classic domestic violence. Obviously, they're overlapping. We wanted to put harm to kids right up front, like as one of these categories, because we wanted to be stronger and clearer about our commitment to safety of kids, and also to understanding the impact of children on the victim parents' decision making. So we really wanted to do that, and then we kind of had the last category of sort of all the other things. The harm to kids category too, we really explicitly rejected the language of abuse and neglect or maltreatment, which is very much a child protection mindset, and we just think that, you know, safety planning and advocacy around kids' safety really shouldn't be framed by child protection. So that's kind of some of our rationale on it now. What did I get wrong, Eleanor?
Okay. Wrong? Nothing. And I'm not sure I have a whole lot to add. I mean, our book is more focused on battering than non-battering or other forms of violence in these bubbles, except for harm to kids. But it seemed to us to be really important to make at least that distinction, because we sort of assume the coercive control, we assume those dynamics in a relationship, and not all situations where somebody has hit somebody else involve that. So it seemed important to make that distinction, while recognizing that there's overlap there, that it's complicated and shifting.
Yeah, there we go. So I mean, these categories are just for advocacy. That's the purpose of them.
Great.
I mean, I have to say, as the researcher head has to also say that there is more research that is coming out that looks at some of that distinction and some of the elements of coercion and control. But it's still in its infancy, and a lot of the research where they're looking at physical violence doesn't make that distinction very clearly, and so we have a long way to go.
And my apologies for not saying this, but IPV is intimate partner violence, so it's kind of, you know, spouses, dating relationships, those kinds of relationships between adults or youth.
Well, one of the things I was thinking about is that it sort of leads us to our next slide, which is this idea that victim-defined advocacy responds to all victims in all situations. And so it's one of those things that if you're not doing that kind of in-depth advocacy with somebody, you may miss what kind of battering or what kind of abuse they're experiencing. And so I like the idea of thinking about, you know, that you don't necessarily need to categorize them so you can check off a box, but it's more in line with what they're experiencing and will be more meaningful and more effective if you're able to understand what they're going through. And so I felt like this was a helpful frame. It's like no matter what the question is, if you're doing victim-defined advocacy, you'll actually get to the answer.
I mean, because if it's battering, it's just a whole different sort of mindset. I mean, some folks that you might be working with are not really as afraid. They're not under control. They can come and go as they please. They can do certain things. They do have control of their money. They're not dealing with all of those things. And so safety planning is going to be a lot different than someone who's really experiencing control at every aspect of their lives and being monitored and all of that kind of really extreme level of violence. I mean, I just think it's also really helpful for us, and I think this is an area where we have work to do, is understanding more about the spectrum of violence that victims are experiencing. You know, most victims are not really exposed to life-threatening danger, although we sometimes kind of approach advocacy as if they are. And so these are things that we have to, do carefully, and we want to, err on the side of caution, of course. But, I think that really changes a lot of our mindset, and a lot of the responses really are designed to deal with life-threatening, battering violence. And I think if you treat every situation that way, there's a lot of consequences about that might not be helpful.
Right. Well, sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry, just could make things worse. We can make things worse.
Yeah. Yes, we can do lots of things. Making things worse is not the thing we're going for.
Not our goal.
Yeah. Well, the other thing I really like about the book is you cover so much in it. And again, I just want to reiterate that this book really is for us. Like we are the audience. So I just appreciate there's so few things that are for us as advocates, and I really felt like this was a gift that just kept on giving. But one of the chapters that you have is chapter 6, which talks about advocacy with kids, and I just feel like you have a lot to say about this, and we have one slide about it. But I thought if you want to share, because it was again a very helpful framework, at least I felt so.
Okay, this is not a bumper sticker for sure. Kids are important for lots of reasons, right? So first of all, we want kids to be safe. They are part of the group of human beings that we care about. Very deeply, but also they're really central to decision making, and Eleanor might want to talk a little bit more about that. But so when we started mulling over this idea of moving to safer, this more relative measure of success, and then we started talking about kids, it got it got more complicated. And so the phrase that we use, which is a bit awkward, so I apologize for that, but the thought about kids is they don't have to just be safer. They have to be safer enough because they are by nature and by law dependent, that there's some responsibility that we have to make an assessment about whether they're safer enough. And So that's kind of where we came up with this idea of what makes children safer and what are the categories. And so these are just the big categories, so violence prevention and reduction. Obviously, for kids to be safer enough, they have to not be being hit or sexually, or, sort of sexual abuse or that kind of stuff. They're, like, there's just no way to be sort of a relative measure of that. That's like no. But then we think about their exposure to the violence against others, and this is where, when you're doing advocacy with victims who are staying in their relationship, you start to think about this. So in talking with victims, one of the safety plans that they sometimes use is having the kids be away if this doesn't always happen, but if the violence is somewhat predictable, like it mostly happens on the weekend when there's drinking or there's some pattern to it, and maybe having the kids be away. So you're reducing their exposure to the violence. Not ideal, again, not what we want, but it's about making things better. Obviously, if we're reducing violence against the adult, we're reducing exposure. So if we reduce the violence that a parent is using, it's reducing the exposure. Economic stability, educational opportunities, the next category. It's similar to basic human needs, but we added education because it's such an important piece for kids. And then well-being, strengthened, it's similar, some of the similar things. That's increasing resilience, making sure that you maintain the connection to a supportive adult or parent. It's something we struggle with here in legal aid when we're doing custody visitation cases. If the visitation order takes the child away from an adult that's supportive, that's something we try to look at and keep in place. For example, it's often the victim parent, but it's not always. Sometimes it's someone else in the kids' lives. And then we have this idea, because a child is dependent, about capable caretakers. For them to be safer, they have to have a capable caretaker. And if it is the parents, if it's the battered parent, if that parent is safer and more supported, that's going to support their parenting. The battering parent obviously has to be less harmful and more helpful. And there's more details on this in the book. I'm kind of just summarizing it. But we wanted to really get in and look at the content and the detail around this, like what makes children safer. And again, just having our work be more rich, more complicated than just, is there violence, then we go to CP, child protection. There's a lot more to be done there. And child protection is, of course, sometimes a necessary step, but it should be a last resort.
Great. We don't have a slide on the battering parent thing, but I'm wondering if you can just talk about anything that you've seen across the country, or when you've talked with advocates about this. I mean, that seems like a shift for us a little bit. Have you heard anything that are promising practices in that, or any pushback?
Oh, there's always pushback. We're advocates. Right. It's what we do, which is great, because it makes us think more, and that's good. I think, Chapter 8 in the book is about the advocate role with partners who use violence. And I think particularly when we realize that so many victims are staying in the relationship, or even if they've left, stay in contact. And let's remember about the kids. Even if mom leaves, the kids are most likely still having contact with the parents. So, we don't just like, oh, mom's out, so that's all good, because it's not still all good for the kids. So there's work to be done there. And I think one of the things that we really are saying in this edition is that we need to pay way more attention to this strategy around reducing and eliminating violence and changing violent behavior. I mean, when you think about it, there really are only two ways to deal with physical violence. One is this physical separation as a safety strategy, which we know is limited and has consequences. And the other is to change violent behavior. And I think we've been, understandably skeptical about folks' ability to change or willingness to change, and we're not saying that we shouldn't still be skeptical, but it's work that we need to kind of pay more attention to. And I think there is evolving work around that, and particularly in the child protection context. It has to be done carefully. It has to be done, obviously, with the battered parent understanding what's happening. But that's part of what our role is to work with the battered parent and make sure she's informed and understands what's happening and when it's working and when it's not, and how she'll assess that.
Yeah, and,
We can't give up. We can't give up on them.
right.
We might give up on some of them, but there's a lot of folks using violence in families, and I don't think we need to give up on all of them.
Yeah, and I think that it really is victim defined because I don't, most survivors and victims don't. Oh, somebody came to Eleanor's house.
I'm having a hard time hearing you. Somebody came to the door.
No problem.
I'm well protected here.
That's good. Well, Lee Hoffheimer, one of our colleagues, says that home visitors have to work with the whole family, and she's wondered if you've heard about anything useful for working with a batterer, if there's anything promising out there that you've heard.
I think I would direct the person to the work that Futures Without Violence is doing,
Okay.
and Lana Davis, and we can sort of send some resources after. But yeah, I think they've been doing the most work for the longest period of time, I think.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about this.
Yeah.
So some of it's been done in Massachusetts, but some of it's been done elsewhere.
Yeah, it's a really
I think there is some work that's promising, but not in the category of promising practice as defined by the federal government and that sort of thing. Yeah.
I think one of the challenges is as an advocate working with the victim, the adult victim, how do we really understand about him through her? Like, we ask about the violence. We do a really great job of cataloging the violence and what his violent behavior is. I think we spend less time because we don't really want to. Let's be honest. We don't really want to talk about him, but we need to because she wants to. She wants to tell us about him. We need to know what makes him tick. Even just to do safety planning, we need to kind of know more about him. Who does he listen to? What influences him? What's the extent of the violence? What does she think might make him change? I mean, victims have ideas about this. And, we can't just dismiss them. I mean, we're going to assess them. We're going to work with her and assess them. It's like, we know you're hopeful that he's going to change, but we know that people who use violence, particularly people who batter, are really manipulative, and they lie, and they're telling that, and like, we're not going to stop saying that stuff, but we are going to, I think, need to stop saying, men never change, it always gets worse, you need to leave. I think that kind of sequence we need to use in a very limited set of circumstances.
Yeah. Well, I think people, this is something that you can maybe share with me at the end, but I do think people would be very interested if you've heard of how advocates in our field are doing that in a particularly helpful or unique or, groundbreaking way. Because I think that it certainly is in line with really being victim defined, and I still think it is hard for us to wrap our heads around what it actually looks like. So if you have resources and you share them with me, then I'll be sure to share them on with other folks as well.
I'll certainly do that, but the other thing I would just say is if you want to learn, you're an advocate, and some of you I'm sure are already doing this, but if you just want to learn more, just start asking victims.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about him. What do you want me to know about him? What do you think will help him change? Is there anything? Does he listen? I mean, just start asking, and you're going to learn, and you're going to build that experience that we all really rely on when we're doing safety planning.
Yeah, and that's a helpful distinction, just that it doesn't, it might not mean you actually getting on the phone with him, but just having more insight into what's going on is really helpful.
We often say to victims, you don't deserve to be hit. What he's doing is wrong. We're really clear about that, which is great. And what I've been hearing when I am doing this work around the country is that when you start talking to victims, they say to advocates, that's great. Will you tell him that?
Uh-huh.
And when you think about it, it's like, and then we say, oh, no, we don't talk to them. Well, some people do. Some advocates and programs do work with and do violence intervention work, but lots of folks don't. And they're like, no, we don't do that, or we only work with you. But it makes a lot of sense when you think about it, what she's asking for. I mean, it's not like, it's not like we're going to pick up the phone and talk to him, but it's just interesting for us to think about.
Absolutely. Erin asks, what tools can we use to help new advocates, or even old ones, or seasoned, I prefer to use seasoned lately, apply this model and develop the skills to consistently do this? So I think it's more in general. Yeah.
Was that all you want? Okay. No. Well, I'm sure you guys are already doing a lot of this, but I would say one thing is we wrote the book so that most of the approach really is all chapter 4. So you kind of get from the beginning to the end of the approach with individual individual advocacy, individual victims is in chapter 4. So that's like one resource I would say you could go to, and we really worked hard to write that so it would make sense to sort of have people read. And I know that in a number of places in the country, people are just kind of having folks read that chapter and then they're talking about it at staff meetings and that kind of stuff. So that's one option. The skill set is like a whole nother set of things to think about. And it makes me kind of think of chapter 9, which is really talking about the victim-defined advocacy environments. Like what supports, what work environments, and what kind of resources do we need as advocates in order to do victim-defined advocacy? And I think that, one of the things that we concluded was really ongoing supervision, which doesn't need to be kind of hierarchical, but just even this peer supervision and peer support and talking with each other is just that mindset, that sort of collaborative and collegial mindset is really essential, because we all have blind spots, and this is difficult, and as we all know, the stakes can be really high, and so no one of us really wants to hold all of it, so that kind of making time and building time into having those kind of conversations and supports is one thing, and I think practice is really helpful. Just practicing it.
Yeah, and Meta was reminding me that advocates are already really good at a lot of these skills. And,
absolutely.
Yeah, and so it's just like putting them together or understanding them in a different way and context can be really helpful, and is also, I think, it is affirming, right? When you do it and you realize that you have a different conversation or the outcome is different, then it makes you do it more and it gets you better. And so that practice, I think, is really a helpful component.
I have to say, too, that when obviously advocates know how to do active listening and those kinds of skills. But when you really embrace victim-defined advocacy, a couple of things I've noticed. One is that folks, they sometimes refer to it as kind of letting go. Like, I let go, like I realize I don't have to fix everything for every person who comes in. I don't have to make it all right. I just have to hear what she has to say and offer what I can offer, and have empathy for the things I can't fix, and help her build the best plan she can build, so that you kind of take yourself off the pressure of trying to have a particular outcome. So I've heard that. And I also find it, I know this is going to sound kind of corny, but it's just really interesting when you listen to people, because you're going to hear different things when you're not asking like all about the violence and the thing and going down the list, but you're just, what's on your mind today? Tell me how why did you call, which is probably how you start, and just have a conversation. And like the people who we work with their lives are really bad sometimes, but they're really neat and interesting people to talk to. And when you see their resilience, when you hear what they've put up with and how they're protecting their kids and all of that kind of stuff, it's just so inspiring. I think and Eleanor, you're much more of an expert than I am, but in the secondary traumatic stress world, this concept of vicarious resilience is really exciting. This thought of really building off of, the strength and not only seeing all the problems and all the harm and all the things you're not fixing, but seeing how folks are coping and adapting and dealing and being strong despite these incredible stresses in their lives. I think, we can take note of that as well.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that term, vicarious resilience. I like that. I'm going to take that with me. That's great.
Well, it's not mine, and there's people that should be cited in all that, so we'll send you that.
We give them credit. Whoever came up with it, thank you. Well, I want to move on to one of the cornerstones, I think, of your last book, and then what you also have in here, which for me was just so helpful as a framework for doing advocacy and specifically doing safety planning, was this risk analysis. And so you've kept this from the last book and put it in. Do you just want to talk us through this in case people haven't seen it before? It's such a helpful frame, and I've shared this with people who don't do advocacy work but who are in different systems. And it has really helped answer that question for why we're so committed to really working with folks and not saying that leaving is the only answer. And the whole concept of life-generated risks, I think, is just very mind-expanding for folks in our system and certainly with outside. So if you just want to share about that.
Oh, this is the only thing that remained from the first edition, isn't it, Eleanor?
Just about, I think.
We used to refer to this way back in long ago as the RAC, the Risk Analysis Chart. We loved a good chart. So and I'll take a run at it. So it's the risk analysis regarding the relationship. So obviously it's like a pro-con, and stay is on one side and leave is on the other, as you can see. And the first thing is the battered generated risks, so risks that are she's facing and the children are facing because of a partner who's battering. And usually we just kind of go through this and say, hey, physical violence is there if she stays, but it can also be there if she leaves. The same with all these other risks. It's, of course, not the same for every victim. Some victims, when they leave, are safe and the kids thrive and everything's better, and it's really important work that we do, and we're going to always keep doing that work and preserving that work. We're really good at it. But it's just kind of this acknowledgement that they don't always go away. And if you look up in the upper right-hand corner there, same, better, or worse, or not sure, when she's making this decision, she may not know if it's going to be better or worse. It might be the same, and she might not know until she gets out. But for lots of folks, it's worse. Some aspect of this is worse. And it could be the physical, it could be financial losses, it could be that she loses connection with her family and friends. There could be legal risks, particularly for folks who have issues around immigration. And then the concept of life-generated risks, which Eleanor talked about earlier too, it's just, if this is also part of the decision about leaving the relationship, and if she stays, there can be financial poverty, and if she leaves. So it's these things about thinking like, if I go, folks for all kinds of reasons, if I reach out and try to leave, I'm going to face discrimination from a system, from a TANF system, from a police, from whatever, and it makes that decision a lot more difficult. And so those are, it's just sort of like, if she stays or if she goes, she's facing the same, she may be facing the same risks or more risks. I mean, I've actually used this even with individual victims, just kind of have them, just kind of thinking through with them, like, okay, so if you leave, what's going to get better, what's going to get worse, what might be the same, or what don't we know about? So it's just a kind of way to really make that clear. I guess the other thing I try to point out on this chart is, if you look in the upper right-hand corner with leave, and then physical violence and sexual violence, if you kind of circle that, that's really where family violence responses that we've built to date focus. We really, lots of legal remedies, often even shelter and domestic violence services, they really sometimes expect victims to leave or require victims to leave. They focus on physical violence, the elements of crimes, and the standards for restraining orders and those kinds of things. That's kind of where we've built the most response, and if that helps folks be safer, that's great, and that's working. But then we've got victims who are dealing with this other range and set of issues, and so they've got a lot more on their mind than we're often talking about, or the systems that we work in are ready to help with. So that's just some of kind of how we think about this.
Yeah, I would just sort of add that a lot of this is the context stuff and the complicated stuff. But looking at responses by major social institutions, some social institutions may require her to leave, like sometimes child protection may actually mandate that. But in other instances, as in sort of the impact of thinking through some of people with different immigration status, they may prohibit or make it much more dangerous for her to leave. So they all fit together, and they're not each separate. They really relate to one another and complicate each one.
Right. Yeah, I
kind of like what, right. It's like, why doesn't she leave? Well, because it's going to be worse. And I know that doesn't, I just want to say again, it doesn't feel good as an advocate to say that, because we don't want anyone to have to stay and be in a relationship where they're being hurt and the kids are being affected, but that's the reality for lots of folks.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, for folks that are having big systems advocacy challenges, I think this can be a really helpful thing to start a conversation with folks in your community about. I just think people haven't necessarily had that aha yet. And, we certainly, as advocates and most people, we don't want any of this for anyone, right? We don't want anyone, including the batterer, to have, this life that isn't healthy and that doesn't feel good, and it doesn't feel good for anybody. And we also recognize, I think, a little bit more of what is happening than other systems. And so I feel like if you're having challenges where people don't understand that leaving is not the only option or is not the thing that is going to be the what makes everything better, this can be a helpful tool.
I mean, this expectation that victims will leave, that any victim can leave if she just wants to, if she just calls the police or calls one of us, she's going to get all the resources and things she needs to leave and be permanently physically separated, is really pervasive in systems. Mm-hmm. And so, the kind of other side of that is that if folks who don't leave are then judged as being stupid or not trying to not making decisions in their own best interest, or, they're bad parents, they're codependent. There's all these labels that get put on folks who don't leave, because, this idea that, I said it earlier, but this idea that leaving is the answer to domestic violence and that victims can leave if they want to is really a lie. And I think, all of us as advocates have, some responsibility to get the real message out there, to have more complex narratives about what victims are facing, what the real choices are or the lack of choices are, and understanding that. Eleanor said child protection. I mean, child protection is a great place where sometimes they don't care. They just say, even if it's going to make things worse for the kids, they're like, no, you have to leave.
Right.
Because we haven't talked more about other options. And that's when you have to start talking about reducing violent behavior.
Yeah, good. I'm going to move on to this next question, which is in some ways more for advocates on the phone. And you all also, I think, in your work know what the answer to this is often, but I'm curious if anybody has some responses about what gets in the way of doing this. So, feel free if Jill and Eleanor, if you want to weigh in while we're kind of waiting for folks to share, or I'm always comfortable with silence. All advocates are comfortable with silence, so.
We'll give folks a minute. What gets in the way of victim-defined advocacy? Wow. Lots of stuff. The first question, I think one of the first questions we got was like, what if we think she's doing the wrong thing?
Yeah.
That gets in the way. Like we're really worried. We're really afraid for her. Those things can override, what we do, and then we go into something called advocate-defined advocacy,
right?
Which we do write about in the book. And then another concept that we talk about is service-defined advocacy. So, I'm the restraining order advocate, so I'm going to talk to you about restraining orders, and, I'm going to try to talk you into one, to be really honest. And if you don't want one, then there's not a whole lot more I'm going to do. I might give you some referrals and some numbers, but, so that, what we do or where we work then defines kind of the work we do, which isn't to say that some people aren't going to have limited roles, because we all don't do everything, but so those are obviously, and the things that you already know are culture and language and funder priorities and time, and talking to someone over the phone can be like having a webinar. I'll really much more appreciate being out there in May and being able to talk with you face to face. You know, talking through technology, we all think it's great, but it has its limitations, and it is great.
Well, we have some answers are coming in. Folks have said bureaucracy,
yeah,
systems-based versus community-based advocacy, overburdened systems, a focus on legal solutions. Somebody else said sometimes the way our work is structured, we can't go to their home, and she might have a disability and can't come to us, or lack of transportation.
Great. Those absolutely get in the way. And I think the expectation of systems that our job is to make her leave also really kind of gets in the way. There is this, I don't know, if you've ever worked in the legal system or in even sometimes with law enforcement, they sometimes give you that look and they sort of say to you, go talk to her. You know, can't you go talk to her? Go talk to her. And I think what they're really saying is, get her to leave. You know, why won't she leave? Because sometimes police are even scared for her because they know they're not going to be able to get there in time, and so they don't want to be afraid for her. I just did a training with better intervention programs, and they really were kind of annoyed that advocates weren't helping victims leave more because, you know, they couldn't change. They know that what they're doing isn't working with everyone, and so, you know, I think that expectation is something we really have to focus on and dismantle.
Yeah. Somebody else just wrote in politics, and I don't know if Colleen, if you want to elaborate on that, but yeah, sometimes just what's happening in your community and how whoever's in charge, I mean, that certainly can make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well,
which then brings us to systemic advocacy.
Right.
But yeah, I know. Yeah.
Colleen says that typing is too hard. Colleen, should I unmute you? Do you want to share? I understand about the typing. Let's see. Let me try and find her and see. Oh no, she's saying no. Okay. Well, we'll just make lots of assumptions about what she's meaning. But somebody else is saying living in a small rural community where everyone knows everyone. That can complicate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I do hope, Jill and Eleanor, I think that for folks who are hopefully prioritizing coming in May, I think that this is something that we will have a chance to dive into and really think about some shifts and that you can make in your programming that can address some of these issues in terms of making it easier to do victim-defined advocacy every time.
I think that, you know, there's a lot of different challenges about working in a rural community, but one of them is around victim-defined advocacy is you really want to know what's going on with her, and she might really want to have some privacy, and that's hard to have in a rural community. It's the same with other kind of maybe a cultural group or a small group of folks where everybody kind of knows everybody, even if it's in a city. And sometimes those folks are actually more comfortable talking to someone outside of the community.
Right. Well, I'm just going to open it up for, does anybody have any other questions or comments that that we haven't covered yet? Or Jill and Eleanor, if you want to address anything that we haven't had a chance to talk about yet. And feel free if you would rather just ask your question. I'm happy if you want to raise your hand. I'm happy to unmute you.
It's just not natural for advocates to be muted.
I know, it's so sad. It's so sad, this system.
It's not who we are.
It's too much power in one hand, mute or unmute. So some folks have written that they're thinking right now.
I love thinking.
Okay, so let's see, Maureen Kelly. I'm going to unmute you, Maureen. Okay, Maureen, are you there? Can you hear us, Maureen? Okay, maybe she didn't mean to raise her hand. Oh, look, she lowered it. Okay. Let's see. Anybody else have a hand raised? No. Okay, well, the good news is that, you know, we will have more time in person. And, oh, look, here's some that are coming in. But I imagine that many of you will have conversations after you get off this, you know, with the group of people that are around the computer now, and that we just want to keep having these conversations. But here's a couple questions. So somebody says, can you talk more about adult IPV, intimate partner violence? We have many women who strike out an abuser and then get arrested themselves as the offender.
Okay. So not battering. Is that what they're saying?
I think in terms of putting it in that category.
Yeah.
Well, I think actually the adult, never mind.
I think, well, one of the things that we said a little snippily in the book, I think, was that we didn't think that folks acting in self-defense were obviously doing anything but defending themselves. And so that I think in the legal system and elsewhere, sometimes they do get categorized as defendants or perpetrators or whatever. And we just thought that that really defied common sense. So we put that folks who are defending themselves in the not battering category just because it is violence, but it's violence in self-defense. So it was a different kind of mindset, and you would actually be doing safety planning with that person. Not with the person they were defending themselves against, for example.
Right.
I'm not sure that gets at the question, though. I apologize.
Yeah, and the adult category is not IPV, so that's perhaps children abusing their parents, sort of other family members, lots of other categories, but it's not intimate partner. So the adult one, there is a separate category.
And I think the other thing is just to acknowledge that this is a real issue that happens. You know, women are arrested all the time for using violence when they're not necessarily the person who's having coercive control, but they're using violence to survive.
Right.
And someone mentions, you know, sometimes the risk of being arrested is something that needs to be addressed in a safety plan, especially when someone is in a relationship with someone who's very emotionally abusive and controlling.
Absolutely. And also, you know, I think it was one of the other reasons why we had this non-battering intimate partner violence category was just, as you said, there can be the violence without the coercive control and the domination and all of that aspect of it, but it's still violence, and it's not good.
Right.
It's not good.
Yeah, and Lee is saying that this conversation gets at the problems with how the law categorizes violence and how it sees violent acts without a context, that is really often the harm to victims and survivors who are using violence. That's one of the harms.
Right. I think that's great. Great point.
Okay, a couple other questions. Somebody says, what are some basic guidance we can give to child welfare workers that can help them better partner with DV advocates in this area?
Wow.
Yeah, fix that system, Jill.
Wow.
Go, Jill.
I don't think I want to come to Washington. You guys ask hard questions. No, I mean, I think a place to begin is to try to have a conversation where you're getting at more of the complexity about what's going on. I think the risk analysis chart that we talked about is one thing to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
I think just obviously reassuring them that you understand their role and their mission around protecting children, and that in order to do that, they need to have capable caretakers. They need to have parents that can be there for them. And if you separate a kid from a victim parent that is their main source of support, you may be doing more harm than good. We spent a lot of time educating child protection about domestic violence, and I think that was really important. But then we need to have more options around what to do once we see the violence is there, and assessing the kids and to see how they're doing. I mean, all kids are affected by the exposure. They are. Some do better than others. And so, that's that concept in those conversations about safe or enough. But I think this having more of a discussion about the range of risks that victims are facing and the limited sense of options. So, for example, it might be a great idea. It might be a really good advice to say to a battered parent, you need to leave him, you need to relocate, and you need to get the kid into therapy. And that could be really good advice given what is happening in the family. But if she has no social or financial resources, that's impossible. So asking someone to do something that's impossible is not helpful. It's very, if we want to use the word, it's very disempowering. And if you know she's going to fail, then it just makes less options and less resources for the kids. So trying to have that conversation, I think, in a really respectful way is a really good place to start. I like to ask the question, like, if, let's say, you want to go to a sporting event or the movies and the tickets are sold out, have you really decided not to go? If there really is no option, you haven't really made that decision. So, battered parents get really punished and blamed for making, making a decision, but they didn't always, some of them are making a decision to stay. They are, and they are responsible for the decisions they make, but some of them have no option, and that's the stuff you want to get at. If they really have no option to leave, then you need to talk that through. And if you work together, then maybe there's more options.
Yeah, that's great.
Well, that was a long question. That's a complicated question. We need to talk more about that.
Well, and
I would like to add one other thing, and that is that there's a lot of encouraging work going on across the country about providing more support to the abused parent and around their relationship with their kids. That really is providing evidence of enhancing or supporting children's well-being, so that not to give up on the abused parent, but maybe to find more resources and supports for her to foster that connection with her kids. Because one thing that we know is that her relationship with her kids really is very central to her. A lot of the decision-making literature really points out how central kids are. And I mean, you all know that, but there's more work being done in programs and by other folks to support that relationship, and it's been very positive.
Yeah.
And what can we do to engage a parent who's battering for change? I mean, that's the other work that's new.
Yeah, that's great. Another question is, if the form drives our work, what are examples of other questions we can ask to prompt us to get the safety planning conversation going in an open-ended way?
So I wanted to say another thing about that. So one thing is the book is full of the questions. I think you'll find them in chapter 4. There's lots of questions. In fact, Eleanor, didn't the editor want to take them out at one point?
Yeah.
Or some of them? So
we exercise a little control there. Yes.
So there are some examples in there as well that might be helpful. And one of the things that could also be helpful as a tool is an outline. So, because there's a lot of things to remember when you're talking with victims on, and, if you're for example, we're in a legal context, there's things that you have to make sure that you ask and those kinds of things. So it's not like you're down it in sequence. But there's lots of ways to just open the conversation about him. How did you meet? I mean, you're going to find out a lot of things. You're going to learn things about their family, about her family. You're going to learn things about culture. You're going to learn a lot of things. So that's just another one. But there's a lot more in the book that are specific, and there's some around kids too that are in the book around questions to ask a parent about kids, to sort of how to open that conversation. And obviously, that's one that has to be done really carefully because folks really are understandably really sensitive when you start talking to them about how their kids are doing and and about their parenting. I mean, no one really wants to be judged on their parenting or how their kids are doing. And women really don't want to think that something's happening that's bad for their kids. They don't want to go there. So when you do go there, when you do have those conversations, obviously it has to be done really carefully and not the first thing or even one of the early things you talk about.
Okay, great. So one of the footnotes is read the whole book, but okay, a couple of other questions. I don't know if you have any thoughts on this. How can we make DV support groups more effective?
Ask them.
Yeah.
Women know.
Great.
Women know. I did some work in another project, and we did some interviews with women who had been in support groups, and then they were out. They were out of the kind of the circle of the support of the DV program for a while, and they came back and they were talking. And one of the things they said was they wanted to keep meeting. They just wanted to keep meeting, but what they decided they wanted to do was to come back to the DV program and watch a movie together, like once every other month or something. And the DV program, this was like, oh, how are we going to do this? And liability, and it's night, and yeah. So they just negotiated some rules about how long they could stay and what would happen, and they just let them do it. And some of those women were still in relationships where they were experiencing violence, and it was an incredibly important means of support. So if you want to know what would help, the great thing about victim-defined advocacy, you just have to ask. It's not going to be the same for every victim, of course.
That's great.
Or groups of victims, but they'll tell you. And you know what else? Eleanor's the expert on the research stuff, but I'll just say, maybe you're not the right person to ask. Like, I know we work really closely in legal aid here in Hartford with our DV programs, and they're amazing programs, and they do amazing work. But sometimes the folks that we're representing tell us about stuff that's going on in the shelter.
Right.
That whatever, and they feel free to feel free to talk to us. So, if I'm sure you guys have those collaborative relationships too, you might, ask one of your community partners to ask the question.
That's a great idea. Yeah. Okay, good. One more question. It says, what are some things we can say to someone who is in an unhealthy relationship, but there isn't really a pattern of power and control?
Well, I think understanding, I'm thinking a little bit, but I think understanding how they came to be there. I think the other thing, and there's a section in the book about risk review and how you do risk review, and one of the kind of core steps in that is to make sure you're right that it's an unhealthy relationship. And to also understand what the good parts are. We don't spend a lot of time as advocates talking about what the good parts are. We want to just know what the bad parts are. And if we understand what the good parts are, then we might understand why a person is in a relationship where there are bad parts. And I think when you ask about the good parts, you're going to develop more of a partnership and a connection so that the person will hear you about, yeah, I understand he's good about that, and he gets along with your mother and your brother, and that's great, and he's good around certain things, but I'm really worried about you around these other things. Tell me about that. How do you deal with that? And I don't think it's our job alone to kind of just show people how bad their lives are.
Right.
I think that really that can undermine coping. It can undermine well-being. It can make folks think that you don't understand and that you won't be helpful. So I say that, but we don't want to just ignore it. Like when we see something bad, that's the art of doing the risk review, is saying things in ways that people can hear. And we all do better coming to conclusions about difficult things when we think we came to it ourselves.
Right.
So, it's about planting seeds and supporting her and keeping the connection and keeping the relationship, because if you just blurt it out and then she's gone, we really haven't made her safer, and we've cut off an incredibly important resource. I think advocates are just essential, important resources, and so we want to be really careful to preserve ourselves as resources for folks. So, it's tricky.
It is tricky.
I would just reinforce the importance of finding out what she likes about the relationship or likes about her partner that so contributes to feeling understood, to engendering trust, to everything, and helps you to understand and do more effective advocacy, as Jill says.
And none of this is like, we're not going to become better huggers,
No.
Like,
No.
No, I mean, it's not like, and we're not going to change our view or our statements that violence is wrong, and people who use it, it's their choice and they need to change. I mean, we're not giving up on any of that. I mean, that's not going away. It's just seeing the whole part. I think in chapter 8 you'll see we played with some graphics, like little pie charts, to kind of help remind ourselves that we need to see the bad part, but we also need to see the good part of him as a partner and a parent, because we want to look at both of those things. And for some women, there's going to be very little good and lots of bad. And for, it's like having a sense of that will help us really understand her decisions and what is likely to make her safer.
Right. Great. To circle back to that question we had asked about what gets in the way of victim-defined advocacy, Colleen did kind of go further in her answer about politics, so I'll just share that with folks. She said that she's thinking about that there is not an opportunity to have conversations about the complexities because it is too risky. For instance, it is true that sometimes victims rather than abusers get arrested because of mandatory arrest, and also that in some situations it is not helpful to arrest anyone because it compounds specific life risks. It is risky sometimes to have conversations exploring the issues of mandatory arrest because it was such a hard-won victory. That's just an example. And I certainly have seen that in lots of different ways, right? I mean, it's sort of like our success of saying that domestic violence is bad has also then made it, well, why are you letting them stay? Why aren't you making them get out of these relationships? So,
right.
Yeah,
I mean, I've done policy work, and it's so easy for us to go to the life-threatening situation, the fatality review, that look as the example. Like, if this if you do this, women will die. If you don't do this, I mean, and I think it's not like we're going to stop talking about that, or that isn't a priority. Life-threatening violence is, of course, should be a priority, but it's kind of rounding out the conversation. And I think you're right; it's really difficult, and we may not be the right people to talk to folks, depending on the politics in the relationship. They might need. I mean, you guys know this too. I mean, a cop might need to talk to a cop. A prosecutor might need to talk to a prosecutor once you kind of get in there and have them do that. But we have to figure out how to do this. We have to figure out how to make this more complex and more real and more honest, and preserve the things that we've already achieved. Because we don't want any of the things we've worked so hard for to go away. We need to preserve them, but now we need more things. We need to really get on top of this blaming victims for not leaving. It's just the judgment and the consequences for victims who don't leave are really profound.
Yeah.
And we had some role in that because of the work we did and the way we did it, and we need to undo some of that. And we're smart enough. We figured all of this out in a short period of time. Look what we created. We're going to figure out this stuff too. And we just have to work with each other and talk about it and think about it.
Yeah. That's great. Well, so many of these tools I think are helpful for that, so thank you. So are there any other, before we move on, well, somebody also mentioned that they love batter huggers and that they may have to use that term, which correct.
Use it carefully. Use it for good and not evil.
So I'm just going to give you another chance, just if there's anything else. We're getting to the, towards the end of our time. And I just want to also say my contact info is at the end, and I think most of you know how to get in touch with me, that, you know, we really want our in-person trainings to be responsive to what you're interested in and want them to be helpful. So feel free to, you know, be in touch afterwards if something particularly resonated or if you wish there was more on something. And we'll have lots of opportunities to continue this conversation. So this isn't your only chance, but if there are other questions, please do either raise your hand or take them in. I'm just loving this conversation. It's really great. So thank you all for participating. Okay, I'm going to move forward off this slide, but it doesn't mean that if somebody writes in a question, we can't answer it. So just some reminders again about logistics, that there'll be an evaluation form that pops up after we close out, and so please do remember to fill that out and let us know if anyone else from your program attended. I want to just highlight some opportunities to stay in touch with us. So like I said, we'll have the in-person trainings in May. So May 5th will be in Federal Way, and May 7th will be in Ellensburg. There was a little glitch on our website that said March for a hot minute, but now it says May again, hopefully. Hopefully it's been switched. So feel free to register for that. They're pretty big spaces, so we'll probably have quite a few people coming, but hopefully it'll still feel like a helpful conversation. Big news for us is that we have our Goodwill Refuse to Abuse 5K at Safeco Field. We have our date and registration is open, so it's July 18th at 9 a.m. and feel free to register you and all of those people in your life who you love and think should walk or run with you. We also need quite a few volunteers, and there's so you can register or volunteer at the same place on our website, which is just refusetoabuse5k.org. And then, of course, we have our annual conference where a lot of these concepts that we've talked about here will be continued, and that's in Spokane this year. So, Eleanor, we hope to see you there, of course.
Oh,
and then
love to.
We have lots of other trainings and webinars that are listed on our calendar at wiscative.org, one of which is that we have a support group training coming up. And that's with Tira, and it'll be really great. It's going to be a bunch of different folks who've had different kinds of support groups sharing how they are doing it, which I'm excited to hear. And so for somebody who asked that question. And then finally, you can always follow what we're doing on Facebook, Twitter, the interwebs, and check out our blog, canyourrelate.org. I actually gave a little shout out about this book in my last blog that I wrote. So, you know, we're always talking about different topics, and amazingly, we haven't talked about football for a while, but for a while we were talking about football, you know, movies, the whole thing. So, but it all relates to the great work that you all are doing. Okay. I think we are at the end. We might even end early. Look, our other gift to you besides this book is 12 extra minutes of your day that you didn't think you were going to have. But I just want to say to both to Jill and Eleanor, thank you so much, not only for being on the call with us, but just for your such incredible and important work that you're doing with and on behalf of survivors and advocates, and we are all better for it. So thank you so much for joining us today.
F, thank you.
Thank you for your interest in the book, and I'm really looking forward to being out there in May.
It'll be great. Hopefully we'll have excellent weather and you'll fall in love. Well, thanks to all of you. Thanks for a great conversation. I know webinars are really hard to participate in, but I really appreciate that you all pushed through and sent in your questions and comments. And I look forward to continuing these conversations in person the next chance that we all get to be together. So thanks, y'all, and have a great day. Take care. Bye, everyone.
Bye.